Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation and introduction to the VCS version 4 public consultation. We're very excited to be hosting this session and very pleased that you all have decided to join us today. My name is Sam Hoffer. I'm the manager of the VCS and CCB programs, and I'll be leading today's session. I'm also joined by my colleague, John Haller, who is a senior program officer who works primarily on the VCS program. John's going to be helping me to administer today's session. So in terms of agenda, pretty straightforward. What we'll start with is a bit of background and introduction for why it is that we saw it as important to be releasing or starting a consultation on VCS version 4. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the logistics of the consultation itself, the format, how it's set up, and how you all can participate. We'll then take a bit of time to tee up some of the proposals that have been put forward that will ultimately form the basis of VCS version 4. And then finally, we'll leave time for question and answer. I'd actually like to leave 20 minutes at a minimum for question and answer. So I'll be going through the proposals relatively briefly. For those of you who haven't used GoToWebinar before, within your control panel on your screens, there is a chat function, and that's how you'll submit your questions. So if questions do come up during the session, go ahead and type those in there and submit them. And we'll be keeping track of those, and then when we come to the Q&A session, we'll just go down the list essentially and respond to those. One recommendation I do have on the Q&A session, when you are submitting questions, what we're really looking for are questions of clarification rather than essentially specific input on the proposal itself. If you do have input or recommendations on the proposal, that's fantastic. But please do submit those as part of the consultation rather than utilizing the Q&A session as that medium. So first, a bit of background, an introduction as to why it is that we've decided that we need to move on to VCS version 4. And there's really two reasons for that. The first is VCS version 3, the current operating version of the VCS program, was launched in March of 2011. VCS version 3 was really designed to operate within the context of the Kyoto Protocol era, which we're obviously moving away from and moving into the Paris era or the Paris world. And so the first primary reason why we saw it as important to develop and release a new version of the VCS program is to ensure that the VCS program is prepared and positioned to operate in that new world. The second reason is there's obviously been a number of significant developments since March 2011. So I've already mentioned the Paris Agreement, which presents a number of interesting opportunities and challenges for the VCS program and the voluntary carbon markets more broadly. The Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, have obviously become a critical component of how the world thinks about sustainable development. There's also been a number of advances in technology. So a number of clean energy technologies, for example, have certainly, we've seen a tremendous uptake of those over the past 10 years or so. And obviously those technologies are becoming more cost competitive with emissions intensive alternatives. And finally, a number of countries and governments have begun to put in place the building blocks for developing jurisdictional and nested REDD+ programs. And so with all of these developments in mind, again, we want to ensure that the VCS program is positioned and adaptable to all of these very significant developments. We had considered, for example, that we could essentially tweak VCS version 3 to integrate and interact with these developments. However, as we went through that thought exercise, it became pretty obvious that the updates that were needed to the VCS program to accommodate these developments and to address these developments really meant that a wholesale new version of the VCS program was necessary. And hence the development of VCS version 4 and hence this public consultation. So in terms of the format of the consultation itself, we launched the consultation on May 17th. The consultation is going to run for 60 days, ending on July 16th. And we've developed a dedicated web page on the Vera website that contains all of the consultation materials that you'll need to access in order to participate in the consultation. And I'm actually going to try and show you on our website where that web page is located so that you can access that easily. So hopefully this works. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Vera homepage. That's vera.org. If you simply scroll down to VCS program and click on the Learn More button, you'll then come to the home page for the VCS program, and at the very top of the page, there's a link here for accessing the VCS version 4 public consultation. And if you scroll down, you'll see all of the materials that you'll need to participate in the consultation. So that includes all of the consultation documents and the consultation roadmap, which I'll say a bit more in a moment, instructions on how to submit comments, and then obviously a registration link for this webinar. So just coming back to the presentation then, a few things I wanted to highlight. So we've structured this consultation perhaps differently than other consultations that you've participated in. I'll start by saying what we didn't want to do, which was to put hundreds of pages worth of program documentation in front of you and leave you all to weed through that and try and figure out what it is that we were proposing to update. And so instead of that, what we've put forward is 8 concrete proposals, which are housed in separate consultation documents, each addressing a different topic that will ultimately be the primary updates and revisions that we would envision making to the VCS program documentation, and which would form the basis for what VCS version 4 is going to look like. So those 8 consultation documents are listed here on your screen and are accessible from that web page that I showed just a moment ago. And we'll talk about each one of these during this presentation at a high level. The last thing that I'll mention is there's a link at the top here, or at the top of that web page, for the VCS version 4 consultation roadmap. This consultation roadmap is essentially a catalog of all the proposals that we're putting forward. And within that catalog, we provide a summary of each one of the proposals. And this is really meant to facilitate your ability to identify quickly those consultation documents and the proposals that you're going to be interested in commenting on. So my recommendation is that when you visit this webpage, start with the consultation roadmap rather than dive into any of the specific consultation documents. Determine which consultation documents are going to be most relevant for you, and then go ahead and submit whatever feedback you'd like. In terms of the format for submitting comments, so we do ask that those are submitted in writing, but beyond that can really be in any format that you like. So if you'd like to just send us an email, please do so at secretariat@vera.org, so our standard secretariat email address. We're also happy for you to put together sort of formal documents with organizational headers and so on, and attach those to an email that you send across. So whatever format works best for you and your organizations, we're certainly happy to receive comments that way. At the end of the consultation, essentially one of two things will happen. Depending on the feedback that we get, we may go ahead and tweak some of these proposals and then move forward with integrating those into the VCS program documents. and then ultimately release VCS version 4. That could potentially happen as soon as October of this year, so essentially giving us enough time to take into consideration the feedback that we get, revise these proposals, update the program documents, and then release all of those. The other option, again, depending on the feedback that we receive, is of course to run a second consultation. So if we find that the feedback is such that we need to make substantive changes to some of these proposals, we will obviously take that into account, update the proposals, and then put those back out for likely another 60-day consultation period, and then we'll essentially go from there. We would envision announcing soon after, or relatively soon after the consultation, the first consultation ends, which of those directions we're going, so that you all have a heads up, what generally speaking was the feedback that we received, and how do we envision moving forward in terms of next steps. So the next part of this session is to tee up each of the 8 proposals that we just saw on the previous screen. So I am going to try and be brief in setting each one of these up. We simply don't have the time here to sort of go into every last detail on each one of the proposals. It's really the consultation documents where you'll want to go to get that exact detail. But I will try and touch on all of the major points of each of the proposals. And again, if any questions come up along the way, do be submitting those in the chat function, and we'll address those at the end. So the first proposal or concept document that we've got as part of the VCS version 4 consultation is a proposal or a consideration to revise the scope of the VCS program. So what we mean more precisely by that is we're proposing or considering to exclude certain project types from future eligibility under the VCS program. This consideration is based primarily on a recognition that certain project types that are currently eligible under the VCS program are simply moving beyond their reliance on carbon finance as a mechanism for making them financially viable. This recognition is really based on our observation, and I think most will be familiar with what I'm articulating here, but a recognition that several technologies are becoming more cost competitive with emissions-intensive alternatives, and quite simply are becoming much more common practice in the market than we've seen before. On the back of that recognition and observation, what we carried out was an extensive literature review that looked at different perspectives with respect to how carbon finance and other characteristics of project activities that are currently eligible under our portfolio are viewed. And so just to put 3 data points or characteristics that we looked at, so those included these 3, but other things, the impact of carbon revenue on an activity's finances and how that impacts the financial viability of the project activities, prevalence or common practice of the activity itself, and current and prospective regulatory support for certain activities. So we performed this literature review that looked at these characteristics at individual project activities. And at the end of that process, we did identify project activities which, in our view, in a significant proportion of cases and in certain circumstances, which we'll talk about in a moment, are simply no longer dependent on carbon finance. And therefore, it's not appropriate for the VCS program to continue supporting those activities. I would also add to this point that generally speaking, we see that it's prudent for us to be doing a periodic review like this as certain technologies and certain emission mitigation activities become more financially viable, gain a foothold in the market, and are much less dependent on carbon finance than before, that it's important for us and prudent for us to be doing an analysis like this periodically and taking a conservative view towards which activities we continue to support under the VCS program. The last point to make is we certainly appreciate that this approach may well lead to the exclusion of certain truly additional projects, but on the basis and on the back of the principle of conservativeness, we believe this is the right approach nevertheless. And so which project types have we identified then? And that's what you see on your screen now in this table. This table is included in the consultation document itself. And I'm just going to walk through this relatively briefly to give you an idea of the different parameters or characteristics along which we've drawn the lines of the proposed exclusions of project activities. So the first column here is specific to activity. So that includes hydro, geothermal, solar, and wind, and the rest of the project activities that you see here. The second and third large columns are split between non-LDC and SIDS and LDC SIDS. So what that means is projects of these types located in these different jurisdictions have different proposals in respect of how they are proposed to be excluded from future eligibility. And likewise, there's a further distinction based on large and small scale. So just to walk through an example, if we look at the third row here and take grid-connected wind as an example, where you see red X's, that is to say that we are proposing to exclude those activities from future eligibility under the program. And where you see the green check marks, it essentially means that those activities would continue to be eligible. So in respect of grid-connected wind, we're proposing to exclude those in the large-scale and small-scale case in non-LDC SIDS countries. And we would continue, or those activities would continue to be eligible in the large-scale and small-scale scenario if those projects are located in an LDC or SID. The last point I'll make here is that there will, of course, be a grace period for this proposal as and when it's implemented. The first is, if your project is already registered with the program, that project continues to be eligible for the remainder of its renewable crediting period. So if you're a non-AFLU project, for example, your full 30-year crediting period will be respected. And if you're already registered, you'll be able to carry that out till its end. Likewise, projects that apply for registration within 3 months of the release of VCS version 4 will also remain eligible and will be eligible to continue on to the end of their renewable crediting periods. After that grace period, any project of the types that are proposed to be excluded here would not be eligible to request registration. The last point that I did forget to mention is, if you don't see a project activity on this list, it means that we are not proposing to exclude it in any fashion. And so this is the first proposal that we've put out there, and of course, welcome your feedback and questions of clarification during this session. The second proposal that we've put out is a proposal to create a new unit under the VCS program, which is specifically meant and targeted to promote domestic climate action and address particular double counting risks that we see on the horizon. So we're referring to this new unit as a domestic climate contribution, or DCC. The reason for developing this new unit is based on a recognition that post-2020 double counting risks may become more prevalent. More specifically, what we mean by that is in the Kyoto world, of course, there were only developed countries, Annex 1 countries, which had taken on targets under the Kyoto Protocol. And so double counting risks between those commitments and the projects developed in country that were certified to the VCS program were limited essentially to those cases. I'm summarizing, of course, but essentially that was the case. Post-2020, under the Paris Agreement, given that essentially all countries have taken on a target, those double counting risks that we experienced under the Kyoto Protocol are likely going to expand much more broadly. We are also proposing to develop this unit because, given that those double counting risks may become more prevalent, we also view that projects may be required to secure corresponding adjustments from host countries in order to address double counting risks. So again, the parallel under the Kyoto Protocol was if you developed in a VCS project in an Annex 1 country, you were required to secure a cancellation of AAUs to address the double counting risks. And so now that it won't be a cancellation of AAUs, but a corresponding adjustment post-2020 is likely to be required of projects developed across the world. And finally, we recognize that host countries may not be willing to make provide those corresponding adjustments to projects. Certainly, we saw this as the case under the Kyoto Protocol. VCS project development in Annex 1 countries was significantly limited because in our experience, it was the case that governments were not in a position or not willing to carry out an AAU cancellation in order to address double counting risks. And so likewise, we see the potential for the same challenge post-2020. And so the question is, how is it that the DCC addresses these double counting risks? And the answer is in respect of the claim that an end user of a DCC can make. More precisely, the end user of a DCC would be able to claim that they have made a contribution towards the host country NDC, rather than making a claim of an offset of their own emissions as they do today with a VCU. And this is the only difference that we are proposing between a DCC and a VCU. At its core, this distinction or this difference avoids the double claiming risk since the emission reduction, quote, remains in country. In other words, the end user does not make a claim of ownership over the emission reduction generated by the project, but rather simply is able to claim that they have contributed towards the host country NDC by purchasing these units and providing finance to these activities in country that are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so the punchline then, and I've alluded to this already, but we propose or envision that the process for generating a DCC would be exactly the same as for a VCU. That is, application of a methodology, validation, verification, registration, and so on. We also envision that DCCs will act as a complement to VCUs, so we're not proposing that DCCs replace VCUs at all. More precisely, if you are developing a project in a country where the government is happy to make a corresponding adjustment for your project, you're perfectly able to issue a VCU for your project as you always have. If, however, you do run into that challenge where the host country is not willing to make a corresponding adjustment, and essentially the double counting risk cannot otherwise be addressed, the DCC, we think, provides critical flexibility to projects that may run into those scenarios. The last point I'll make on this proposal is we certainly appreciate that this is a huge shift in the messaging that end users would need to make around their claims in respect of providing finance to these projects, purchasing and retiring the credits. But we think this is really a critical and opportune time to be starting a conversation around this. Hence, us are putting it out there for consultation and consideration. So I'm going to move a bit more quickly through the remainder of these. Those first two proposals were really, I might say, the most comprehensive. The third proposal that we've put out there is an update to our requirements around project crediting periods, specifically for non-AFLU projects. So today, non-AFLU projects are eligible for 10-year crediting periods, which can be renewed twice. We are proposing to revise those requirements such that projects would have an option between a 7-year, twice renewable crediting period or a 10-year fixed crediting period. So those of you familiar with the CDM will recognize that this is exactly in line with what CDM does today. And this proposal is basically based on a recognition that the current requirements for crediting periods are likely too long. Primarily, we have identified that it's likely not the case that non-affluent projects require 30 years worth of carbon finance support in order to be financially viable. And also, as many of you familiar with the VCS rules are aware, at the end of your crediting period, or at the end of a project's crediting period, projects are required to go through a revalidation and assess the continuing validity of their baseline scenario, and also test regulatory surplus. And so again, we think that given the timescales that are currently in place, and given the fact that circumstances affecting these characteristics are likely to change on shorter timescales, we're proposing to shorten those. The final point I'll make here is that this proposal would only apply to new projects. That is, if you're already registered or have already completed validation, you can continue under the existing VCS requirements. The next proposal is a proposed update to VVB accreditation recognition. So today, VCS program recognizes VVBs that are accredited to ISO 14065 by accreditation body that is a member of the IAF. We also recognize DOE accreditation under the CDM. This proposal is to move to only a recognition of VVBs accredited under ISO 14065 by an accreditation body that is a member of the IAF. This proposal is based really on two things, which is that in recognizing or allowing multiple forms of VVB accreditation, we've identified this has led to an inconsistency with respect to the levels of accreditation oversight of VVBs. So essentially differences in the levels of oversight between the multiple forms of accreditation that we've recognized historically, and also an imbalance in the level of participation that we, Vera, have been able to have with the different accreditation bodies. And this is really key because Vera has become more involved in accreditation and VVB performance feedback to accreditation bodies in recent time. And so it's really critical that we're able to do that. And that's essentially a second driver for this proposal. And so the way that we would envision this working more precisely is that we would be signing MOUs with really as many IAF members as we're able, but we've already undertaken an analysis, in fact, to identify those IAF members which are likely going to be most important to have a relationship with. And as many of you are aware, we already have such a relationship with ANSI, which is the American IAF member, and SCC, Standard Council of Canada, which is the Canadian IAF member. We also envision a potential to work directly with IAF, but essentially these are the different pathways that we would envision taking forward. And we think this would essentially address our concerns with respect to consistency of oversight and VVB performance feedback. And finally, we would envision an effective date for this on January 1, 2020, meaning that VVBs would need to achieve ISO 14065 accreditation by that date to continue to be eligible, providing validation verification services under the VCS program. The next proposal that we've put out there is the creation of a new project report template, which is specific to highlighting a project's contributions to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'll say a bit more about that in the next slide, but essentially the reason for developing this and putting this forward is that we're obviously aware that SDGs have generated a lot of interest amongst corporates, investors, NGOs, development banks, governments, and others, and that projects are already reporting against the SDGs, but right now in an inconsistent and unstandardized way, which has led to inconsistencies, of course, in the way that projects are communicating this. And so I'll talk more about the report itself on the next slide, but what is envisioned is that projects would complete this new report template, submit that to Vera, and Vera staff would actually be the ones responsible for reviewing the reports themselves. And assuming that everything checks out within those reports, we would produce a project SDG contribution statement that could be used by the project for communications purposes. So to make a little bit more sense about that, on the left here, you see the new project SDG contributions report template, which we're proposing to release as part of VCS version 4. And within that template, project proponents would specify SDG targets to which they have contributed, expressed in terms of official SDG indicators. Evidence of those contributions would need to be provided and could be drawn from validated project descriptions or verified monitoring reports of those VCS projects. You could also use evidence from other reputable sources, of course. As I mentioned on the previous slide, Vera staff would then review those reports and issue an project SDG contribution statement, which is what you see on the right. And this is just an example of a template statement that we've put together. Both the report templates, which is longer, it's 10 pages or so, it's longer than what you see on your screen here, and this example here, which is actually 2 pages, can be viewed on the consultation webpage. The last thing that I forgot to mention is in reviewing a project SDG contributions report, Vera would charge a fee for that review. Within the consultation proposal, that fee is currently proposed at $1,500 for each report review. The next proposal is in respect of streamlining our methodology approval process, and more specifically, the existing VCS rules under the methodology approval process are such that methodologies go through 2 VVB assessments. We're simply proposing to remove the first VVB assessment in all cases. This proposal is based on a recognition that Vera staff in recent years have become more involved in the methodology approval process to provide editorial and technical guidance, which has really led to 2 things, which in our view, more consistent methodologies in terms of the way that they're structured, the way that the language reads and so on, and also that we've been able to resolve many technical issues at an early stage. Now, we think this has been beneficial, but of course it adds additional time and cost for Vera staff to be more involved in the process, to be doing more lengthy reviews than we have in the past. And so to accommodate that, we're proposing to remove one of the VVB assessments. So Vera staff reviews, for folks who have developed methodologies and been through this process before, our review scope won't change, or it's not envisioned to change. We'll continue to ensure primarily that methodologies are well structured, but also that there are no major inconsistencies with the VCS rules. And we would envision addressing those issues during each of our reviews throughout the process. The other important thing to highlight with this proposal is that we're proposing an update to the method for VVB selection. Again, as those of you familiar with the process will know, for what is currently the second VVB assessment, Vera contracts directly with that VVB, and we would envision that continuing. The change would be that rather than the methodology developer putting out a request for proposals to VVBs and then essentially selecting their preference of VVB, Vera staff would actually take the lead in terms of putting out RFPs to all eligible VVBs that could possibly do the methodology assessment. We would then narrow down that list of VVBs that respond with a proposal to those that we view have the highest technical experience and expertise in reviewing the methodology, and then we would present those options for the methodology developer to select. The last point here is that we are proposing an increase to Vera fees, given this more involvement that we've had throughout recent years. And what you'll see here is essentially for new methodologies and substantive revisions, the current fee overall is $10,000 and we're proposing to increase that to $15,000. And for minor methodology revisions and certain tools and modules, we're proposing to increase from $5,000 to $7,500. And so I should say, too, that while this is an increase in VERA fees, we still envision that this would be an overall cost and time saving for methodology developers, given that that second VBB assessment would not be necessary. The next proposal is, I would say, a number of proposals within a single proposal. And these are a number of considerations in terms of updates to the VCS AFLU requirements. And really where these considerations stem from is the fact that, as the leading GHG program for AFLU projects, we, VERA, need to seek to ensure that AFLU projects continue to support global efforts on climate change, and that they are in a position to adapt and be positioned well for the future. And so these updates mainly address trying to ensure that the AFLU requirements are more user-friendly and streamlined where possible, but also addressing key risks that have come up historically in the operation of AFLU projects. And so I won't go into all the detail for each of these in the interest of time, but just to give a very high-level overview of what are essentially 5 considerations for revisions to the AFLU requirements. So the first is to standardize reference region selection criteria. So currently, individual methodologies are what set out the criteria for selection of reference regions. What we've done is gone through those methodologies and come up with a standardized list of reference region selection criteria. And the proposal is essentially to house those in the AFLU requirements rather than in the methodologies, so that all projects are utilizing the same criteria for selection of the reference regions. And of course, this will only be applicable to certain AFLU projects that need to select a reference region. The second consideration is putting forward optional default non-permanence risk ratings. So again, current rules are projects go through an individual assessment of non-permanence risk using the VCS non-permanence risk tool. And at the end of that process, the projects are assigned a risk rating. Now, we're aware that that is a lengthy and costly process for both the developer and the VBB. But our observation is that, in fact, there's not much differentiation between the risk ratings that come out of that process. And so what we propose doing is going through an exercise of identifying what could be default non-permanence risk ratings that projects could apply without going through the non-permanence risk tool. The next consideration is a mechanism for identifying potentially inactive projects. So this is something that we've gotten feedback on from a number of stakeholders. And more precisely, what we mean by this is for those projects which have not gone through a verification in 5 years and have therefore had buffer credits put on hold per the existing VCS rules, what we're proposing to do here is create a new status on the VCS project database that would identify those projects as such, and then also implement a process by which we would reach out to these projects to identify what their current status is. The main reason for this is we recognize that projects that have not gone through a verification in 5 years does not mean that necessarily that project activities are not still happening on the ground. It may well be the case that the project proponent is simply waiting for the right time to go through its next verification. And so there would be a process of understanding what is happening with the project, and then putting essentially a letter or a statement on the VCS project record to describe what that status is. The next proposal is strengthened requirements for local stakeholder engagement. So of course, we recognize that the success of AFLU projects is highly dependent on successful stakeholder engagement. To date, the VCS rules have relied on a few key requirements for stakeholder engagement, but we're essentially proposing to strengthen those. And the way that we've gone about this is we've taken certain requirements from the 3rd edition of the CCB standards and essentially taken from that what we view as really the most critical requirements for ensuring positive local stakeholder engagement and put those forward as proposing to include those in the AFLU requirements themselves. And finally, there's a consideration or a proposal in respect of RED Plus projects nesting in jurisdictional RED Plus programs. The first thing I'll say on this is this piece is certainly a work in progress. I would say the proposals are perhaps not as developed as far along as some of these others. But really where we're coming from in this proposal is that the VCS rules do not currently provide pathways for projects to use jurisdictional reference levels unless those are developed using the JNR requirements. But now that governments are submitting RED Plus reference levels to the UNFCCC or publishing those elsewhere, VERA recognizes the importance of facilitating project proponents' use of jurisdictional reference levels. Accordingly, we are considering a number of updates to the VCS rules that would facilitate nesting. This is part of a broader strategy to establish concrete nested pathways to ensure that RED Plus projects support the development of government-led RED Plus programs. I won't get into the details of exactly what we're putting forward here because we simply don't have time for that. But please do take a look at the initial proposals that we've put out there. And really what we're looking for on this one is feedback on the workability of what we've put forward for these nesting pathways, and really any feedback in respect of anything that we've missed or other things that we should be thinking about. So the last proposal that I'll go over here is a proposal to reorganize the VCS program documents. So we're proposing to do this in three ways. Number one is to more clearly delineate project level and methodology level requirements in separate documents. So more specifically, what I mean by that is those of you familiar will know that the VCS methodology requirements are right now spread across the VCS standard, the AFLU requirements, and the ODS requirements. And if you're developing, one of those methodologies, you would have to essentially look across all of those documents or several of those documents in order to identify all of the requirements that you need your methodology to comply with. What we're proposing is essentially to create a new program document, which would be titled Methodology Requirements. And so all of those would be located, all of those methodological requirements would then be transported into those documents. And our hope is that then the VCS standard and other program documents become much more streamlined. And for those developing a project, you essentially don't need to weed through the methodology requirements. And we recognize that there's been some confusion about, where project level or methodology level requirements might apply. And so this is meant to address that. We're also proposing to restructure the text in the documents themselves to better distinguish between descriptive text and requirements. And you'll see from the consultation document how we're proposing to do that. And we're also proposing to remove outdated information. As I mentioned at the start, VCS version 3 has been in effect since March 2011. Some of the content and requirements that are in there are even harkening back to VCS 2007.1, which was the version previous to version 3. And a lot of that is just simply outdated and irrelevant. So we're simply proposing to remove all of that. And so all of this is, as I said before, based on a recognition that navigating program documents can be challenging. And so we're trying to address that. Really want to stress here, provide other recommendations. If you're familiar with the VCS program documents and you've used them before, I've had a number of really great conversations with project developers and VBBs as to the challenges that they've run into. And frankly, this is where most of these proposals come from, is on the back of those conversations. So if there's things that you've run into or you've got concrete proposals for better ways that we could structure the program documents, please do suggest those as part of the consultation. Okay, so we've run a bit over the time that I would have liked, but we do have some time for question and answer. We've been tracking your questions up until now. Please do continue submitting questions and we'll respond to that within the remainder of the time allotted. If questions come up today, of course, we're always here to respond to those. Submit those to secretariat@vera.org and we'll be happy to respond. But with that, I'm going to pass to John, who's been keeping track of the questions and is going to go ahead and read those out, and he and I will respond to those as best we can.
Yep. So we have a handful of questions that were submitted, so thanks everyone for your input and your submissions. The first question here, and with these I'll be paraphrasing, so please feel free to chime in if any of these are mischaracterized. With respect to the project scope revisions, is there any coordination with Gold Standard or CDM to have similar restrictions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't want to get into too much detail on that because I'm not aware that Gold Standard or CDM has put out a public proposal for doing such. I would recommend that the folks who are asking that question reach out to Gold Standard and or CDM to hear from them what they're thinking. I would say from our perspective, that would absolutely be a very positive outcome if those three programs were to move forward in a consistent fashion. But again, without sort of something public from that I'm aware of from those other programs, I won't go into detail as to what they are currently thinking in that respect, but certainly do reach out to them to sort of hear thoughts as to whether they are working on a similar proposal.
The next question we have here, again, relates to the scope revision. Has Vera done a supply analysis to understand how the scope revisions may affect supply of VCUs to the market?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. We have done such an analysis, and John, I might ask you to help me out here because it's been a bit of time since we've looked at that. The short answer that I'll give is the analysis actually suggests that the project types that we are proposing to exclude from future eligibility are actually representing less and less of the supply percentage of credits issued under our program. And on the flip side, those projects which we're proposing to remain as eligible under the program are representing a larger proportion. The other important point to note is, as I said, for existing registered projects, those continue on until the end of your crediting period. So roughly speaking, we're beginning to see the first of project crediting period renewals from non-affluent projects anyway. So those existing projects, really have 20 years or so remaining in their lifetime. So the existing supply that we've seen from those projects already registered with our program is not going away. And then likewise, as I said before, the projects that will continue to remain eligible and that new registrations will come through on, our analysis shows that actually supply from those project types are increasing. John, I wonder if you have anything to add to that.
I think you hit the major points. The results of our analysis and our projections show that it will continue to be an adequate supply based on the volume and the potential of our current portfolio alone.
Great.
So the next question relates back to the analysis and that we have done for the scope revision as well as the accrediting period revision. The question is whether Vera will make public the analysis and results that was done in developing out those two items.
I would say that what we want to share in respect of that analysis is included in the consultation document itself. And I would say that's true, I think, also for the crediting period revision. So, obviously during this presentation, I've only been able to give a brief overview of the analysis that we did. But take a look at the consultation document itself. If that doesn't answer your question, the details that are included in the consultation document, of course, feel free to reach out. We're happy to discuss that in more detail.
And again, to the revisions of scope of the VCS program, would the revisions also apply to projects that apply methodologies which use performance thresholds for additionality? So the example provided in this question is the campus clean energy methodology. under which projects assess additionality based on overall performance and emissions reductions compared to the sector. The point being raised in this question is that this methodology may include project activities included within this scope revision.
Yep. Good question as well. The short answer is yes, it would apply to such methodologies. In other words, even if the methodology applies a standardized method for demonstrating additionality, the proposal right now, at least, is that the proposal for exclusion of those activities going forward would likewise apply even if the methodology utilized a standardized method.
This next question, I think I can partially answer, and Sam can chip in. To which markets does VCS intend the name sector scope changes to apply? And so there's a couple examples here. So, for example, only grid-connected electricity generation / industrial power generation. Yes, the scope revisions apply only to grid-connected electricity generation. And then the second half of this question is, can we be more specific regarding the domains to which we intend the scope exclusions to apply, since, for example, transportation projects would also be considered fuel switch fossil fuels? That's a great question. So taking that first example listed here, fuel switch fossil fuels, I don't know that transportation projects would actually be relevant there. Fossil fuel switch projects, as we're defining it, pertains to switching from a fuel with a higher carbon intensity to a fossil fuel with a lower carbon intensity in the generation of heat for industrial processes or power plants. Moving down the list, waste heat, if I could provide some additional context or background on how we're defining that, is using the thermal content of hot waste gases that would be vented in the absence of the project to replace fossil fuel use. This does not apply, for example, to waste gas utilization, where flammable waste gases are captured and flared or otherwise utilized. Energy efficient lighting for the proposed scope revision applies to replacing incandescent bulbs with CFLs or LEDs, and energy distribution refers to the construction or provision of transmission lines in the transportation of power. Sam, did you have anything else to add to provide context to that question?
Not in terms of context, but thanks very much for the question. This is actually a topic that I anticipate getting some feedback on, and it would be really helpful for us if, when you look at the proposal, the project activities or the types of the categories that we've put forward are not perfectly clear. So if they are not perfectly clear, that's really good feedback for us, because of course, in determining whether a project type is going to continue to be eligible or not is going to be dependent on how well and how precisely we make that definition. So do please provide that feedback as part of the consultation if it's not perfectly clear.
Switching gears to the SDG proposals, will the SDG report be required to validate projects?
Good question. So the SDG report is purely optional. So no, it is not required in order to go through validation. It's completely up to the project proponents as to whether they wish to complete the report, submit it, and have a statement issued by Vera staff.
We have two more questions here, and please do continue to add any questions you may have. Will new local stakeholder engagement rules be made mandatory requirements prior to the issuance of credits? For example, will high-quality local stakeholder consultations be mandatory?
Yes is the answer. That when these requirements go into effect, projects will be required to meet with them in order to complete validation and ultimately verification. One thing I didn't mention is there is a grace period for this specific proposal that is set out in the consultation document. I'm blanking a little bit on exactly what that is, but my recollection is I don't believe that we're proposing for this to be applied to existing projects or even projects that are contracted for validation sometime after we release the requirements. The reason of that, of course, is, if you're an existing project or you're contracted for validation, you were not aware that these requirements were coming forward. You may have not designed your project in a manner that would comply with these rules. So there is a grace period. As I said, I'm blanking a little bit on exactly what the details are, but those details are in the consultation document itself.
This next question, the last one that we have teed up for this webinar, is how much flexibility have we left to adapt to upcoming decisions in bodies like ICAO, the evolving UNFCCC requirements, and Article 6?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think what's embedded in that question is probably around the scope revision proposal and also the DCC proposal. That is, we're obviously aware that there are ongoing negotiations around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Likewise, ICAO in respect of the CORSIA, the rule book and are still being negotiated and set out. In both of those proposals, either in a footnote or actually in the abstract section, we do acknowledge sort of the ongoing negotiations and considerations under those different fora. And more precisely, what we acknowledge is that in these proposals that we've put forward, we're certainly making some assumptions about what's going to be required, under Article 6, under the Paris Agreement more broadly, to address double counting, likewise under CORSIA, likewise in respect of what additionality looks like and what lens that's viewed through post-2020. And so the consultation documents speak to that and acknowledge that, and essentially the message that's put forward in the consultation documents is, if things are to shake out in these fora much differently than what we're assuming, then of course we may well have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. And I spoke to this earlier about potentially a second consultation phase, which may be relevant to this as well. So that's sort of a long-winded way to say that yes, we are giving ourselves a bit of flexibility, recognizing that there's a lot of very important conversations and negotiations going on in the fora that have been identified. We're aware of that, and we're prepared to adapt or respond to that accordingly based on how those conversations shake out. So we've come to the last of our questions, and we are at the end of our time. I wanted to thank everyone for joining today. I hope this session was useful. As I said, if you do have questions that come up after today, be submitting those to us. Otherwise, please do submit your feedback on the consultation in writing. We need feedback on all of these proposals. We need your reactions to them. In terms of next steps, so there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Vero website. So if you've had colleagues or others who've not been able to join today, please point them in the direction of that. It'll be housed on, in the next few days on the consultation webpage on our website. So please direct your colleagues or others to that if they're interested in listening in later. Other than that, thanks again very much for joining, and we look forward very much to your feedback on the consultation. Thanks very much, everyone.